Chapter 1 Constitution Why and How. Introduction. This book is about the working of the Indian Constitution. In the chapters that follow, you will read information about various aspects of the working of our Constitution. You will learn about the various institutions of the government in our country and their relationship with each other. But before you begin to read about elections, governments, and presidents and prime ministers, it is necessary to understand the entire structure of the government and the various principles that bind the institution of government have their origin in the Constitution of India. After studying this chapter, you will learn what is Constitution means, what a Constitution does to the society, how Constitution governed the allocation of power in society, and what was the ways in which the Constitution of India was made. Why do we need a constitution? What is constitution? What are its functions? What role does it perform for a society? How does the constitution relate to our daily existence? Answering these questions is not as difficult as you might think. Constitution allows coordination and assurance. Imagine yourself to be a member of a reasonably large group. Further, imagine that this group has the following characteristics. The members of this group are diverse in various ways. They have different religious allegiances. Some are Hindus, some are Muslims, some Christians, and some perhaps profess no religion at all. They are also varied in many different respects. They pursue different professions, have different abilities, have different hobbies, different taste in everything from films to books. Some are rich and some are poor. Some are old, some young. Imagine further that members of this group are likely to have disputes over various aspects of life. How much property should one be allowed to own? How should it be compulsory that every child be sent to school, or should the parents be allowed to decide? How much should this group spend on its safety and security? Or should it build more parks instead? Should the group be allowed to discriminate against some of its members? Every question will elicit a variety of answers from different people. But for all their diversity, this group has to live together. They are dependent upon each other in various ways. They require the cooperation of each other. What would enable the group to live together peacefully? One may say that perhaps members of this group can live together if they can agree on some basic rules. Why will the group need certain basic rules? Think of what would happen in the absence of some basic rules. Every individual would be insecure simply because they would not know what members of this group could be do to each other. Who could claim rights over what? Any group will need some basic rules that are publicly promulgated and known to all members of that group to achieve a minimal degree of coordination. But these rules must not only be known, they must also be enforceable. If citizens have no assurance that others will follow these rules, they will themselves have no reasons to follow these rules. Saying that the rules are legally enforceable gives an assurance to everybody that others will follow these, for if they do not do so, they will be punished. The first function of the Constitution is to provide a set of a basic rules that allow for minimum coordination amongst members of the society. Activity. Enact the thought experiment of this section in the classroom. The entire class should discuss and arrive at some discussion that would apply to everyone for this entire session. The decision could be about how would the class representative be chosen? What decision will the representative be able to take on behalf of the entire class? Are there some basic decisions that the class representative cannot take without consulting the entire class? You can add any other items to this list. Collection of community for the class, organization of picnic and trips, sharing of common resources, as long as everyone agrees to it. Make sure that you include those subjects that have led to any differences in the past. How to revise this decision in case you need to. Write down all these decisions on a paper and put it up on the notice board. Which problem did you encounter in this decision? Were there differences among different students? How did you resolve these differences? Did the entire class gain something from this exercise? A specification of decision-making powers. A constitution is a body of fundamental principles according to which a state is constituted or governed. But what should these fundamental rules be? And what makes them fundamental? Well, the first question you will have to decide is who gets to decide what the laws governing the society should be. You may want rule X, but others may want rule Y. How do we decide whose rule or preferences should govern us? You may think the rules you want everyone to live by are the best, but others think that their rules are the best. How do we resolve this dispute? So, even before you decide what the rules should govern this group, you have to decide who gets to decide. The Constitution has to provide an answer to this question. It specifies the basic allocation of power in a society. It decides who gets to decide what the laws will be. In principle, this question, who gets to decide, can be answered in many ways. In a monarchical constitution, a monarch decides, and some constitution like the old sovereign union, one single party was given the power to decide. But in democratic constitutions, broadly speaking, the people will get to decide. But this matter is not so simple, because even if you answer that the people should decide, it will not answer the question how should the people decide. For something to be law, should everyone agree to it? Should the people directly vote on each matter as the ancient Greeks did? Or should the people express their preferences by electing representative? But if the people act through their representative, how should these representatives be elected? How many should there be? In the Indian Constitution, for example, it is specified that in most instances, Parliament gets to decide laws and policies, and that Parliament itself be organized in a particular manner. Before identifying what the rule, law in any given society is, you have to identify who has the authority to enact it. If Parliament has the authority to enact laws, there must be a law that bestows this authority on Parliament in the first place. This is the function of the Constitution. It is an authority that constitutes government in the first place. The second function of a constitution is to specify who has the power to make decisions in a society. It decides how the government will be constituted. Read the cartoon. Countries of European Union tried to create a European constitution. The attempt failed. Here is a cartoonist expression of this attempt. Does this always happen in any constitution making? Limitation on the powers of government. But this is clearly not enough. Suppose you decide who had the authority to make decisions, but then this authority passed laws that you thought were patiently unfair. It prohibited you from practicing your religion, for instances, or if enjoying that clothes of a certain color were prohibited, or that you were not free to sing certain songs, or that people who belong to a particular group, caste, or religion would always have to serve others and would not be allowed to settle any property, or that government could arbitrarily arrest someone, or that only people of a certain skin color would be allowed to draw water from wells. You would obviously think these laws were unjust and unfair, and even though they were passed by government that had come into existence based on certain procedures, there would be something obviously unjust about the government enacting these laws. So, the third function of a constitution is to set some limits on what a government can impose on its citizens. These limits are fundamental in the sense that government may never trespasses them. Constitutions limit the power of government in many ways. The most common way of limiting the power of government is to specify certain fundamental rights that all of us possesses as citizens and which no government can ever be allowed to violate. The exact content and interpretation of these rights varies from constitution to constitution, but more constitution will protect a basic cluster of rights. Citizens will protect from being arrested arbitrarily and for no reason. This is one basic limitation upon the power of government. Citizens will normally have the right to some basic liberties to freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of association, freedom of conduct a trade or business, etc. In practice, these rights can be limited during times of national emergency, and the Constitution specifies the circumstances under this rights may be withdrawn. Aspirations and the goal of a society. Most of the older constitutions limited themselves largely to allocating decision-making power and setting some limits to government power. But many 20th century constitutions, of which the Indian Constitution is the finest example, also provide an enabling framework for the government to do certain positive things, to express the aspirations and goals of a society. The Indian Constitution was particularly innovative in this respect. Societies with deep entrenched inequalities of various kinds will not only have to set limits on the power of government, they will also have to enable and empower the government to take positive measures to overcome forms of inequality and deprivation. For example, India aspires to be a society that is free of caste discrimination. If this is our society's aspiration, the government will have to enable or empower to take all the necessary steps to achieve this goal. In a country like South Africa, which had a deep history of racial discrimination, a new constitution had to enable the government to end racial discrimination. More positively, a constitution may enrich the aspiration of a society. The framework of an Indian constitution, for example, thought that each individual in society should have all that is necessary for them to lead a minimal dignity and social self-respect, minimal material well-being, education, and etc. The Indian Constitution enables the government to take positive welfare measures, some of which are legally enforceable. As we go on studying the Indian Constitution, we shall find that such enabling provisions have the support of preamble to our Constitution. And these provisions are found in the section of fundamental rights. The directive principle of state of policy also enjoined government to fulfill certain aspirations of the people. Fourth functions of a constitution is to enable the government to fulfill the aspiration of a society and create conditions for a social justice. Enabling provisions of a constitution. Constitutions are not only rules and regulations controlling the powers of government, they also give powers to the government for pursuing collective good of a society. Constitution of South Africa assigns many responsibilities to the government. It wants the government to take measures to promote conservation of nature, make efforts to protect person or group subjected to unfair discrimination, and provide that the government must progressively ensure adequate housing to all, health care, etc. In the case of Indonesia, also, the government is enjoined to establish and conduct national education system. The Indonesia Constitution ensures that the poor and destitute children will be looked after by the government. Fundamental identity of a people. Finally, and perhaps even more importantly, a constitution expresses the fundamental identity of a people. This means the people as a collective entity come into a being only through the basic constitution. It is by agreeing to a basic set of norms about how one should be governed and who should be governed that one forms a collective identity. One has many sets of identity that exist superior to a constitution. But by agreeing to certain basic norms and principles, one constitutes one basic political identity. Second, constitutional norms are overarching framework with which one pursues individual aspirations, goals, and freedoms. The Constitution sets authoritative constraints upon what one may or may not do. It defines the fundamental values that we may not trespass. So, the Constitution also gives one a moral identity. Third, and finally, it may be the case that many basic political and moral values are now shared across different constitutional traditions. If one looks at constitutions around the world, they differ in many respects. In the form of government, they enjoin in many procedural detail, but they also share a good deal. Most modern constitutions create a form of government that is democratic in some respect. Most claim to protect certain basic rights, but constitutions are different in way they embody concepts of national identity. Most nations are an amalgamation of a complex set of historical traditions. They weave together the diverse groups that reside within the nation in different ways. For example, German identity was constituted by being ethnically German. The constitution gave expression to this identity. The Indian Constitution, on the other hand, does not make ethnic identity a criterion for citizenship. Different nations embody different concepts of what the relationship. Read a cartoon. The writing of the new Iraqi constitution after the collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime saw a lot of conflict between different ethnic groups in the country. What do these different people stand for? Compare the conflict depicted here with the depicted in earlier cartoons for the European Union and India. Between the different regions of a nation and the central government should be this relationship constitute the national identity of a country. Authority of a constitution. We have outlined some of the basic functions a constitution performs. These functions explain why most societies have a constitution. But there are three further questions we can ask about constitution. What is a constitution? How effective is a constitution? Is a constitution just? In most countries, constitution is a compact document that comprises a number of articles about the state, specify how the state is to be constituted and what norm it should follow. When we ask for the constitution of a country, we are usually referring to this document, but some countries, the United Kingdom for instance, do not have one single document that can be called constitution. Rather, they have a series of documents and decisions that taken effectively are referred to as a constitution. So, we can say that constitution is a document or a set of documents that seeks to perform the functions that we mentioned above. But many constitutions around the world exist only on paper. They are mere words existing on a parchment. The crucial constitution is how effective is a constitution, what makes it effective, what ensures that it has a real impact on the life of peoples. Making a constitution effective depends upon many factors. Mode of promulgation. This refers to how a constitution came into being, who crafted the constitution, and how much authority did they have. In many countries, constitutions remain defined because they are crafted by military leaders or leaders who are not popular and do not have the ability to carry the people with them. The most successful constitutions like India, South Africa and the United States are constitutions which were created in the aftermath of the popular national movements. Although India's constitution was formally created by the Constituent Assembly between December 1946 and November 1949, it drew upon a long history of the nationalist movement that had a remarkable ability to take along different sections of Indian society together. The constitution drew enormous legitimacy from the fact that it was drawn up by people who enjoyed immense public credibility. The capacity to negotiate and command the respect of a wide cross-section of society, and who were able to convince the people that the constitution was not an instrument for the aggrandizement of their personal power. The final document reflected the broad national consensus at the time. Some countries have subjected their constitution to a full-fledged referendum, where all the people vote on the desirability of a constitution. The Indian constitution was never subjected to such a referendum, but nevertheless carried enormous public authority because it had the consensus and backing of leaders who were themselves popular. Although the constitution itself was not subjected to a referendum, the people adopted it as their own by abiding by its provisions. Therefore, the authority of a people who enact the constitution helps determine in a part its prospects for success. Debate over constitution making in Nepal. Making a constitution is not always an easy and smooth affair. Nepal is an example of complicated nature of constitution making. Since 1948, Nepal has had 5 constitutions. In 1948, 1951, 1959, 1962 and 1990. But all these constitutions were granted by kings of Nepal. The 1990 constitution introduced a multi-party competition, though the king continued to hold final powers in many respects. For many years, Nepal was faced with militant political agitations for restructuring the government. The main issue was the role of a monarchy in the constitution of Nepal. Some groups in Nepal wanted to abolish the institution of monarchy and establish republic form of government. Others believe that it may be useful to shift to limited monarchy with a reduced role for the king. The king himself was not ready to give up powers. He took over all powers in October 2002. Many political parties and the organization demanded the formation of a new constituent assembly. The Communist Party of Nepal, MOIS, was it in the forefront of the struggle of popularly elected constituent assembly. Finally, under pressure of popular agitation, the king had to install a government acceptable to the agitating parties. This government has stripped the king of almost all powers. In 2008, Nepal emerged as a democratic republic after abolishing the monarchy. Finally, Nepal adopted a new constitution in 2015. The substantive provisions of a constitution. It is the hallmark of successful constitution that it gives everyone in society some reasons to go along with its provisions. A constitution that, for instance, allowed permanent majorities to oppress minority groups within society would give minorities no reason to give along with the provisions of a constitution, or a constitution that systematically privileged some members at the expense of others, or that systematically increased the power of a small group in society would cease to command elegances. If any group feels their identity is being stifled, they will have no reasons to abide by the constitution. No constitution by itself achieves perfect justice, but it has to convince people that it provides the framework for pursuing basic justice. Do this thought experiment, ask yourself this question: what would be the content of some basic rules in society, such that they give everyone a reason to go along with them? The more constitution preserves the freedom and equality of all its members, the more likely it to see does the Indian constitution, broadly speaking, give everyone a reason to go along with its board's outline? After studying this book, one should be able to answer this question in the affirmative. Balanced institutional design. Constitutions are more often subverted not by the people, but by small groups who wish to enhance their own power. well-crafted constitution fragmented powers in society intelligently so that no single group can subvert the constitution. One way of such intelligent designing of a constitution is to ensure that no single institution acquires monopoly of powers. This is often done by fragmenting power across different institutions. The Indian Constitution, for example, urgently fragmented power across different institutions like the legislature, executive, and the judiciary are even independent statutory bodies like the election commissions. This ensured that even if one institution wants to subvert the constitution, others can check its transgressions. An intelligent system of check and balance has facilitated the success of the Indian Constitution. Another important aspect of intelligent institutional design is that a constitution must strike the right balance between certain values, norms, and procedures as authoritative and at the same time allow enough flexibility in its operations to adapt to changing needs and circumstances. Too rigid a constitution is likely to break under the weight of a change. A constitution that is, on the other hand, too flexible will give no security, predictability, or identity to a people. Successful constitutions strike the right balance between preserving core values and adapting them to new circumstances. You will notice the wisdom of makers of the Indian Constitution in the chapter of the Constitution as a living document. Chapter 9, the Constitution is described as a living document by striking a balance between the possibility to change the provision and the limits on such changes. The Constitution has ensured that it survives as a document respected by people. This arrangement also ensures that no section or group can on its own subvert the Constitution. Therefore, in determining whether a constitution has authority, you can ask yourself three questions. Were the people who enacted the constitution credible? This question will be answered in the remaining part of this chapter. Secondly, did the constitution ensure that power was intelligently organized so that it was not easy for any group to subvert the constitution? And most importantly, does the constitution give everyone some reasons to go along with it? Most of this book is about this question. Also, is the constitution the locus of people's hopes and aspirations? The ability of a constitution to command voluntary allegiance of the people depends to a certain extent upon whether the constitution is just. What are the principles of justice underlying the Indian Constitution? The last chapter of this book will answer this question. Read the cartoon. Why does the cartoonist describe the new Iraqi constitution as the castle of cards? Would this description apply to the Indian Constitution? How was the Indian Constitution made? Let us find out how the Indian Constitution was made. Formally, the Constitution was made the Constitutional Assembly, which had been elected for undividing India. It held its first sitting on 9 December 1946 and reassembled as a Constitutional Assembly for divided India on 14 August 1947. Its members were chosen by indirect election by the members of the provisional legislative assemblies that had been established in the Government of India Act 1925. The Constitutional Assembly was composed roughly along the lines suggested by the plan proposed by the Committee of the British Cabinet, known as the Cabinet Mission according to this plan. Each province and each princely state or group of states were allotted seats proportional to their population, roughly in the ratio of 1:10. As a result, the provinces that were under direct British rule were 292 members, while the princely state were allotted a minimum of 93 seats. The seats in each provinces were distributed among the three main communities, Muslim, Sikhs and Journal, in proportion to their respective populations. Members of each community in the provincial legislative assembly elected their own representative by the method of proportional representation with single transferable vote. The method of selection in the case of representative of princely state was to determine by consultation. We must make our political democracy a social democracy as well. Political democracy cannot last unless there lies at the base of it social democracy. What does social democracy mean? It means a way of life which recognizes liberty, equality, fraternity as the principle of life. These principles of liberty, equality, fraternity are not to be treated as separate items in a trinity. They form a union of trinity in the sense that to divorce one from other is to defeat the very purpose of democracy. Liberty cannot be divorced from equality, equality cannot be divorced from liberty, nor can liberty and equality be divorced from fraternity. Without equality, liberty would produce the supremacy of the few over the many. Equality without liberty would kill individual initiative. Without fraternity, liberty and equality could not become a natural course of things. Are the principle of liberty, equality and fraternity being practiced in your classroom? How can they coexist? Discuss this with your friends. The previous section discussed the three factors that make a constitution effective and respectable. How far the constitution passed this test? Composition of the Constitution Assembly. A consequence of the partition under the plan of 3 June 1947, those members who were elected from territories which fell under Pakistan ceased to be members of the Constituent Assembly. The number of members in the Assembly were raised to 299. The Constitution was adopted on 26 November 1949, 284 members were actually presented on 24 January 1950 and appended their signature to the Constitution as finally passed. The Constitution came into force on 26 January 1950. The Constitution was thus framed against the backdrop of the horrendous violence that the partition unleashed on the subcontinent. But it is a tribute to the fortitude of framers that they were not only be able to draft a constitution under immense pressure, but also learn the right lesson from the unimaginable violence that accompanied the partition. The constitution was committed to a new conception of citizenship, where only would minorities be secure, but religious identity would have no bearing on citizenship rights. But this account of the composition of a constituent assembly that drafted the constitution touches upon only the surface of how our constitution was made. Although the members of assembly were not elected by universal suffrage, there was a serious attempt to make the assembly a representative body. Members of all religions were given representations, and the scheme described above. In addition, the assembly had 28 members from the scheduled caste. In terms of political parties, the Congress dominated the assembly, occupying as many as 82% of the seat in the assembly after the partition. The Congress itself was such a diverse party that it managed to accommodate almost all shades of opinion within. The principle of deliberation. The authority of the Constituent Assembly does not come only from the fact that it was broadly, though only not perfectly, representative. It comes from the procedures it adopted to frame the Constitution and the values its members brought to their deliberations. While in any assembly there claims to be representative, it is desirable that diverse sections of society participate. It is equally important that they participate not only as representative of their own identity or community. Each member deliberated upon the constitution with the interest of whole nation in mind. There were often disagreements amongst members, but few of these disagreements could be traced to members protecting their own interests. There were legitimate differences of principle, and the differences were many. Should India adopt a centralized or decentralized system of government? What should be relation between the state and the center? What should be the powers of judiciary? To the constitution protect property rights? Almost every issue that lies at the foundation of a modern state was discussed with great sophistication. Only one provision of the constitution was passed without virtually any debate: the introduction of universal suffrage, meaning that all citizens reaching a certain age would be entitled to be voters irrespective of religion, caste, education, gender, or income. So, while the members felt no need at all to discuss the issue of who should have the right to vote, every other matter was still discussed and debated. Nothing can be better testament to democratic commitment of this assembly. The Constitution drew its authority from the fact that members of the Constitution Assembly engaged in what one might call public reason. The members of the Assembly placed a great emphasis on discussion and reasoned argument that did not simply advance their own interests but give principles, reasons to other members for their positions. The very act of giving reasons to other makers you move away from simply a narrow consideration of your own interests, because you have to give reasons to others to make them go along with your viewpoint. The voluminous debates in the Constituent Assembly, where each clause of the Constitution was subjected to scrutiny and debate, is a tribute to public reason at its best. These debates deserve to be memorialized as one of the most significant chapters in the history of Constitution, making equal in importance to the French and American revolutions. Procedures. Importance of public release was emphasized in the mundane procedures of the Assembly as well. Assembly had 8 major committees on different subjects. Usually Jawaharlal Nehru, Rajiv Prasad, Sardar Patel or B.R. Ambedkar chaired these committees. These were not men who agreed with each other or many things. Ambedkar had been a bitter critic of the Congress and Gandhi, accusing them of not doing enough for the upliftment of scheduled castes. Patel and Nehru disagreed on many issues. Nevertheless, they all worked together. Committee usually drafted particular provisions of the constitution, which were then subjected to debate by the entire assembly. Usually, an attempt was made to reach a consensus with the belief that provisions agreed to by all would not be detrimental to any particular interest. Some provisions were subject to the vote, but in each instance, every single argument, query, or concern was responded to with great care, and in writing, the Assembly met for 166 days, spread over 2 years and 11 months. Its sessions were open to the press and the public alike. The President of a Constitution Assembly, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, the Chairman of Drafting Committee, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, greeting each other. I have realized, as nobody else could have, with what zeal and devotion the members of Drafting Committee, especially its chairman, Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, in spite of his indifferent health, have worked, we could never make a decision which was or could be ever so right as when we put him on the drafting committee and made him its chairman. He has not only justified his election but has added lusters to the work which he has done. In this connection, it would be invidious to make any distinction as among the other members of the committee. I know they have all worked with the same zeal and devotions as its chairman, and they deserve the thanks to the country. Dr. Rajendra Prasad, 6 November 1949. Inheritance of the nationalist movement. But no constitution is simply a product of the assembly that produces it. An assembly as diverse as the Constituent Assembly of India would not have functioned if there was no background consensus on the main principle the Constitution should enshrine. These principles were formed during the long struggle for freedom in the way the Constitution Assembly was giving concrete shape and form to the principle it had inherited from the nationalist movement. For decades preceding the promulgation of a constitution, the nationalist movement had deliberated many questions that were relevant to the making of the constitution. The shape and the form of government India should have, the values it should uphold, the inequalities it should overcome, answers for and those debates were given their final form in the Constitution. Perhaps the best summary of the principles for the nationalist movement brought to the Constituent Assembly is the Objectives Revolutions, the revolution that defined the aims of the Assembly, moved by Nehru in 1946. These revolutions encapsulated the aspirations and values behind the Constitution. What the previous section termed as substantive provisions of the Constitution is inspired by and summed up by the values incorporated in the Objectives Resolution. Based on this resolution, our Constitution gave institutional expression to these fundamental commitments: equality, liberty, democracy, sovereignty, and cosmopolitan identity. Thus, our Constitution is not merely a maze of rules and procedures, but a moral commitment to establish a government that will fulfill the many promises that the nationalist movement held before the people. Main points of objective revolutions. India is an independent sovereign republic. India shall be union of erstwhile British Indian territories, Indian state and the other parts outside British India and Indian state are as willing to be part of union. Territories forming the union shall be autonomous units and exercise all powers and functions of the government administration except those assigned to or vested in the union. All powers and authority of sovereign and independent India and its constitution shall flow from the people. All people of India shall be guaranteed and secured social, economic, and political justice, equality of status and opportunities, and equality before law, and fundamental freedoms of speech, expressions, belief, faith, worship, vocation, association, and action subject to law and public morality. The minorities, backward and tribal areas, depressed and other backward classes shall be provided adequate safeguards. The territorial integrity of the Republic and sovereign rights on land, sea and air shall be maintained according to justice and law of civilization. The land would make full of willing contribution to the promotion of world peace and welfare of mankind. Institutional arrangements. The third factor ensuring effectiveness of constitution is a balanced arrangement of institution of government. The basic principle is that government must be democratic and committed to the welfare of the people. The Constituent Assembly spent a lot of time on evolving the right balance among the various institutions like the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. This led to the adoption of parliamentary form and the federal arrangement, which would distribute government powers between the legislature and the executive on the other hand and between the state and the central government on the other hand. While evolving the most balanced governmental arrangements, the makers of the Constitution did not hesitate to learn from experiment experience of other countries. Thus, the framers of the Constitution were not averse to borrowing from other constitution traditions. Indeed, it is a testament to their wide learning that they could lay their hands upon their any intellectual argument or historical example that was necessary for fulfilling the task at hand. So they borrowed a number of provisions from different countries. But borrowing these ideas were not slavish imitation. Far from it, each provisions of a constitution had to be defended on grounds that it was suited to India's problems and aspirations. India was extremely lucky to have an assembly that, instead of being parochial in its outlook, could take the best available everywhere in the world and make it their own. One likes to ask whether there can be anything new in a constitution framed at this hour in the history of the world. The only new things, if there can be any in constitution framed so late in the day, are the variation made to remove the faults and to accommodate it to the needs of the country. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, 4 November 1948. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar presiding over discussion in the Constitution Assembly. Provisions adapted from constitutions of different countries. British Constitution. First passed the post-parliamentary form of government, the idea of the rule of law, institution of the speaker, his role, lawmaking procedures. Irish Constitution, that to principle of state policy. French Constitution, principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. United States Constitution, Charter of Fundamental Rights, power of judicial review, and independence of the judiciary. Canadian Constitution, a quasi federal form of government, a federal system with a strong central government, idea of residual powers. Conclusion. It is a tribute to the wisdom and foresight of the maker of the Constitution that they presented to the nation as a document that enshrined fundamental values and highest aspirations shared by the people. This is one of the reasons why this most interactively crafted document has not only survived but become a living reality. When so many other constitutions have perished with the paper they were first written on, India's constitution is a unique document which in turn became an exemplar for many other constitutions. Most notably, South Africa, the main purpose behind the long research that went on for most 3 years was to strike the right balance so that institutions created by the Constitution would not be haphazard or tentative arrangements, but would be able to accommodate the aspirations of the people of India for a long time to come. You will know more about these arrangements through the study of remaining chapters in this book.